self-development practices. So the first thing that we have to appreciate, and when we talk about self-development practices or self-development per se, what this is synonymous with is in fact human maturity, subjective well-being, an enhanced sense of subjective well-being, as well as spiritual development. The terms are all synonymous and they all mean the same thing. So one could say that we're sort of leaning more on a spiritual aspect in tonight's lecture, and you'll see aspects of that coming through. But again, with respect to the self-development practices, and something we're going to cover, you can take it from both a relative perspective as well as an absolute perspective. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later. So when we look at self-development, what essentially we mean, and if we look at it in a general sense, self-development or the practice of self-development involves the reduction of our egocentric demands and attachments that we place on the world and on ourselves. Anything which attempts to reduce this burden, we call as self-development practices or spiritual disciplines. So as we know, self-development or human evolution per se is a state one reaches or achieves. And I'm just reiterating, this has been covered already, but it's important that you appreciate and understand this aspect. So when we talk about self-development, essentially what we are meaning by that is an independence from the world. Now, when I say independence, I'm not talking about, no, you know, Craig, I'm off the grid and you know, there's a stream that runs through our property and I grow my own vegetables. Very, very independent of the world. You know, the world can burn down and I think I should be fine. We're not talking about that. But what we are talking about is the satisfaction, the sense of happiness that you gain that is independent of external situations or circumstances, or even the environment. So when you achieve a state that is likened to happiness, satisfaction, contentment, but that state you arrive at not because of something or because of someone, but an inner feeling. This is what we mean by self-development. So as you grow in maturity, what happens is you start becoming less and less dependent on the external world for your own sense of subjective well-being. So now, why we say this is self-development is because what happens when you don't develop yourself? You become a slave, as it were. Mentally, you're bound by the world. So what happens is, as soon as you become connected with this external environment, as soon as you're invested in the external environment to derive a sense of satisfaction, you are subjected to the changes in those external environments too. So the external environment is pleasing to you, you're pleased. The external environment doesn't cater to you, you are unhappy, miserable, depressed. So when the environment changes, your mental state changes. This is, in other words, the opposite of self-development, a very immature way of functioning and existing within the world. So when we talk about self-development, it's going to be in the context here of an ideal. And I explain the importance to you. Again, this is something we touched on, but we're just bringing it in within the context of these spiritual disciplines or self-development practices. So when we talk about this pursuit, a state that every person is relentlessly pursuing, and that is a state of happiness. Again, Happiness is something that we've all achieved at some point. But no way do you say, well, I've done happiness, I've done satisfaction, I've done contentment, no need to go back there. It's not like that. You may have seen Niagara Falls, beautiful sight, amazing. You may have seen New York City, you may have seen the pyramids. Brilliant, amazing. Would you go back? Don't really need to go back. I've seen it, it's fine. Happiness is not quite the same, because you are, again, having experienced a sense of happiness, satisfaction in your life, you're again trying to gain it. In fact, the majority of our pursuit in life is for the attainment of this state. Now, whether you want to call it happiness, whether you want to call it satisfaction, whether you want to call it contentment, bliss, peace, they all mean the same thing, essentially. Now, our pursuit thus hinges on this ideal of attaining not only happiness now in the present, but a happiness that is eternal, that is unbroken, that is everlasting. That's what human beings essentially are looking for. Now, you may have heard of these ideas: self-realization, nirvana, enlightenment, ascension, all big words used by all the scriptures everywhere. And what that state represents is this exact state we are looking for: unbroken, permanent satisfaction or peace. So whenever we say self-realization, see, we're all different people from different backgrounds. Some people, you start saying things like enlightenment, self-realization, this is starting to get a bit religious-y for me, or this is starting to get a little bit into the esoteric zone. It doesn't sit comfortably. Again, try to put that all aside. But what we mean by this, what we mean by self-realization, enlightenment, is this absolute state of peace and bliss. Now, all Vedanta does is it says, listen, this is where you want to get to. We understand. Everybody is searching for this peace and happiness. Whatever vocation you are in, or whatever undertakings and actions you engage in to try and get there, we're all essentially trying to get there. Some of us may or may not know. So all Vedanta does is, here we go, we understand where you're trying to get, and here is the roadmap for you. So Vedanta presents not only the theory on how to get there, but the practice to attain that. And that's where the emphasis of tonight's discussion is going to be on, is in those practices that we engage in which we can attain the state of absolute peace and bliss. So when we talk about self-development, these are obviously stages from where you are now. You are an individual, and you may recognize that there are certain aspects within your personality that require improvement. So each stage of self-development is culminating or culminates ultimately in Vedanta, the end of knowledge, which is this state of self-realization. Now, what you have to appreciate is that self-realization, this absolute state, represents an absolute ideal. That's the end game. Beyond that, there's nothing else to achieve. For instance, I say to you, if you are 100% content, satisfied, you got to imagine this, because none of us are always content, always happy, always satisfied all the time. If we were, then neither you nor I would be here. What would we need to engage in anything with? Hey, would you like to go for an ice cream? It's not going to add to my happiness. Would you like a new house? If you're 100% satisfied, how's that going to improve my situation? I'm going to come and repossess your house. So what? Doesn't matter. I'm 100% happy. I'm fulfilled, completely fulfilled. What does it matter? It makes no difference. Simple mathematical equation that proves this is infinite plus infinite equals infinite. Infinite minus infinite, infinite. So this state of self-realization is the infinite happiness, and that represents the absolute ideal. Self-development, on the other hand, is a relative ideal. And these are important ideas to understand. Because for most people, setting an ideal, an absolute ideal of self-realization is too far off. It doesn't make any sense. Yeah, it sounds nice, but you know, where am I and where is that? I'll give a simple example. You know someone who's you know, pretty lazy, doesn't really exercise. Tokyo Olympics are coming up, and all of a sudden he gets inspired. Wow, see, surfing is an Olympic sport now. I think I'm going to try for the Olympics in 4 years' time. 30 years old, never surfed before. You can even appreciate that the chances are pretty slim. So what happens? Day one comes, he's got to start his training. There's no real enthusiasm because it's too far away. And that's exactly where self-realization lies for most people. It's too far away to inspire us to achieve it. Therefore, we pitch these relative ideals of self-development. And every step, so you may say, listen, in a year's time, I want to be portraying this at my physical level, this at the level of my actions, this at the level of my emotions, and intellectually, I want to have gained this much more insight. You may set that as a self-development goal. Every self-development goal essentially culminates in self-realization. So the practice is essentially the same, whether you're aiming for the ultimate or you're aiming for relative ideal. Now, when we talk about an ideal, we need to understand the importance of the ideal. So whether this ideal is absolute in self-realization, enlightenment, or relative self-development, what we have to understand is that in the pursuit of this ideal, and this is why we're stressing the importance of self-development as an ideal. See, you may have a goal to achieve a certain amount of money, of wealth, of health. Now, as we know, anything can happen at any time. So you've set up a business plan and it's a new restaurant. All of a sudden, Cyril comes and says, restaurants are closed. Now, how do you pursue that wealth? You can't really. External environment, it's external circumstances have come along and impinged on that pursuit. Now, if you take anything pertaining to the world and the pursuit thereof, there's a limitation, and that attempt to gain that particular goal can at any point be derailed. It's not so of self-development. You could be rich, you could be poor, you could be miserable, you could be happy, you could be knowledgeable, you could be ignorant. You could be anything, and yet still maintain the ideal of becoming a better person, developing the personality, growing into a sense of maturity. So the pursuit of that ideal, relative or absolute, gives us a sense of purpose, something to wake up for in the morning, a sense of direction in our life. And that direction, that pursuit, in fact, it was very interesting. I was just doing some research for this talk, and this goal or sense of purpose or direction in life has a much heavier weight in terms of one's overall sense of happiness. There are various ways in which they measure this. They said pleasures, trifling pleasures play such a small part in our overall sense of well-being. But this sense of purpose, this sense of direction that we develop in life by pursuing an ideal, it weighs far greater in our overall sense of subjective well-being. So what this pursuit of the ideal then also does, it safeguards us in a way from any existential crisis. Now, what you also have to appreciate, without the setting of self-development, self-realization as an ideal, there would be no reason to pursue any of these practices. In other words, put it on a more physical level. If you're a smoker, let's say, and you're not interested in changing your habits, you're not interested in quitting smoking, you have no interest in health, why would you start investigating the damages of smoking? Why would you start investigating exercise as a healthy way of living, functioning? Why would you investigate nutrition as a term, as in a sense of developing your body's ability to function better, optimizing its usage? Well, you wouldn't. It would stop there. The buck would not move. There would be no interest that drives the pursuit of a healthier life. Similarly, if you have no interest in self-development, then there's no point or there's no purpose in engaging in these practices. And that's why we're trying to establish the importance of this ideal from the get-go. So this is what brings us to the practices themselves. And you're going to hear this term yoga come up. Again, we're not referring to yoga in the sense of balancing on your head for long periods of time, standing in these strange postures, deep breathing. That's not what we mean by yoga in the context of, that is yoga, of course. But in the context of what we're talking about, when we use this term yoga, it actually means to join, to reunite. So when we use this term yuj, it's the root word of yoga, it means to join, to unite. And you may say, well, hang on a second, yeah, what's this got to do with any self-development practice? That unification, or that reunification, shall I say, because all yogas attempt to reunite you to that absolute state of peace and bliss, unbroken peace and bliss. So any attempt to regain that absolute state of peace and bliss, we call as yoga. Now we're going to get into each of the yogas that one could engage in, which defines these self-development practices. So when we talk about a state of well-being, again, as mentioned, this is a state independent of external situations or circumstances, an inner happiness, as it were. The happiness that we experience in the world arises, and you may want to take this down. In fact, this is one of the ways in which we define happiness. Happiness is a cessation of mental agitation. Happiness is defined as cessation of mental agitation. Cigarette smoker needs a cigarette. Has a cigarette, satisfied. He knows in 1 hour he's going to need another one. As it gets closer to that time, that craving starts agitating him. Cigarette, cigarette, cigarette. It occupies his thought. He picks up the cigarette, he smokes the cigarette. What's happened? There is a cessation of agitation. How is it achieved? By contacting the desire. This is how most people derive a sense of satisfaction, a sense of happiness in the world, by pursuing their desires. This is indiscriminate thought. This is indiscriminate pursuit of a desire, which, as we know, cultivates more and more desires. Now, what you must also appreciate is all these mental agitations that arise within the personality come from unfulfilled desires. Now, can you imagine you're indiscriminately pursuing desires, creating more and more desires? What you in effect are doing is you're producing a greater preponderancy for there being more unfulfilled desires. I don't know if you're following here. See, you have a particular group of desires. Now you go all out to get those desires. You may say, I'm happy. I've got everything that I wanted or wished for. You'd have a point, except for the fact that the mind is insatiable. Trace back, I don't know if you remember. Remember we talked in the early stages. Mind is insatiable, even in the stress lecture. It will not stop its pursuit. So you've fulfilled those handful of desires that you may have had. All of a sudden you find yourself back in that situation of being unhappy. Why is that? Well, those 5 desires that you had, indiscriminate pursuit of them, have created many more desires. And so it goes, the cycle carries on, and you end up chasing your own tail, trying to fulfill your desires, creating more fulfilling. A more sensible way of attaining happiness, by now you will appreciate, is, anybody? What is a more sensible way? See, one way to get happiness is attain your desires. But the problem with that, as we've described, is it generates more desires. And so you're sitting with a whole lot of unfulfilled desires. That's the mental agitation, which is the opposite of happiness. So what is a sensible way of attaining happiness? Anybody? See, if any of you can answer this, then I know you're following. If you can't, then I must explain more. One way of getting happiness is, yes, Lee.
To reduce your desires.
Excellent.
Sorry.
It's okay. Excellent. That is the sensible approach to gaining happiness. To, well, Caitlin also, to not have desires. That would be in the absolute sense. But reducing your desires is also going to reduce your mental agitations. Less desires means less unfulfilled desires. That means less mental agitation. So how do we go about reducing our desires? Well, this is nothing but the 4 spiritual disciplines, or the 4 self-development practices. 4 a number. Now you may wonder why there's 4 a number. Usually Vedanta talks about 3, but we cannot exclude the 4th one, and that's why I'm including it here. So when we talk about 4 practices, what we must understand is that they come from our 3 equipments. So when we talk about karma yoga, this is the first spiritual discipline, first self-development practice. Karma yoga is the path of action, and that pertains to, obviously, your body. Your body is perceiving and acting. Bhakti yoga is the path of devotion, and this applies to the mind. Jnana yoga is the path of knowledge, and this, of course, applies to the intellect. Hatha yoga is the path of compulsion, and as you will see, this is for people that don't quite qualify for the other 3. But I'll explain this a little bit more. So when we look at human beings, we can divide them up into, according, let's say, to their inner nature, or the relative strength of their mind and intellect. So the first category or classification or class of people we can call as active. Now, a person is termed active when the mind and intellect are more or less equally developed. It's about 50-50, somewhere near there. So they could at sometimes be emotional and at other times be quite rational. But there's this ebb and flow in between, going between this mind, intellect. We would define these people as having a mixed temperament. So a person with a mixed temperament, balanced in mind and intellect, is more geared for karma yoga, the path of action. Now with the emotional cadre of person, you can see the mind is definitely more pronounced than the intellect. This person is definitely more emotional, more impulsive, devotional, we could say, and hardly at all rational, not really intellectual. They don't contemplate. So he or she is functioning off feelings and emotions. This is a second category of people. This type of person would require a form of God or an altar or some personal God to which they can pour out their emotions. Now, what happens here is this devotion to this personal God or this idol, whatever, displaces all these lower thoughts and tendencies. So the mind shifts towards the higher, thereby displacing, getting rid of the lower desires. So this will be true for all of these practices. Essentially, again, what are the practices essentially attempting to achieve? Well, the removal, eradication of desires, purification of desires, changing the quality, uplifting the nature of desires. See, if it works like a pyramid, at the bottom you have a whole host, a pyramid shaped like that. Now at the bottom you have a whole host of desires, gross desires, and there are lots of them. Then as you develop and grow in the personality, what happens? You have fewer desires. This is termed growth. A person who has less desires than person A has less desires than person B means person A is more mature, spiritually evolved than person B. That's all it means. And as you move up and up and up, you get fewer and fewer desires. The quality of the desire increases, the quantity of the desire decreases. This is spiritual evolution. So when we look at an intellectual person, here we can clearly see that the intellect is far more developed than the mind. These people, they are analytical and rational, far from being impulsive or emotional. The intellect controls the mind at every step. He is objective, an inquirer into the truths of life. So for someone that is more intellectually inclined, we would, of course, guide them towards Jnana Yoga. Jnana Yoga essentially is the path of knowledge, which differentiates between what is real and what is unreal. Now, the fourth cadre of people, and this is very rare, you hardly ever find people like this. And these are the indolent class of people. Now, the indolent class of people, you'll see, intellect is almost non-existent. And you may say, well, doesn't that make them emotional? No, because at the same time, they hardly display any feelings. There's hardly any emotion. They're almost stone cold, they call it. So a person, and again, a very rare person falls in this category. They neither fit for karma, they are neither fit for jnana, neither are they fit for bhakti. So therefore, they are given these physical exercises that are forcefully administered. Now, through the physical body, imagine you are standing there in these poses on your head. Now, don't get me wrong. Hatha yoga has a place, very, very useful exercise. In fact, I've been doing yoga for, I don't know how many years, every morning, part of my regular routine. So there's definitely a value in it. For the body, keep it healthy, supple. But when the context of spiritual discipline, self-development practice, Hatha yoga is designed for this indolent type person. Now, what happens is after a series of asanas, pranayamas, this guy, this girl is standing, what am I doing? Standing on my head, sparks that thought, thinking, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? That ushers them then into the above three categories. So what we also have to appreciate is the above, because we have these three classes, let's say active, emotional, intellectual, and excluding indolent for now. So what we have to appreciate is that no one is purely active, or no one is purely emotional, or no one is purely intellectual. In fact, we are degrees of these. So in terms of analyzing for oneself, because essentially this is what it boils down to, you're going to need to analyze your own personality. Okay, the starting point is we all agree, or we all understand the need for self-development, or as a practice, as a means to reach a more permanent state of peace and bliss. That's understood. Now we need to assess where we are all. Now, The majority of you, I would say, is probably inclined more to the intellectual side of things. The fact that we're on the fourth lecture and you're still here, an indication that there is some knowledge firing, there's some intellectual interest firing. But that doesn't mean you don't have an active or emotional component to your personality. It's all proportions. And this creates the variety of human beings we see in the world because of these varying components. So it's important for you to assess your nature and then determine from that assessment where best fits in, how to structure your self-development practice. So the first one we're going to look at is karma yoga. And this is essentially the yoga of action or the path of action. Now, karma actually means action. So karma yoga, using action to achieve an absolute state of peace and bliss, if you were to break it down. Now, what we have to understand is that all our actions emanate from what we call as vasanas, the seed of a personality. From the vasanas springs forth thoughts. The thoughts then manifest further as desires, and those desires then take the form of action. So karma yoga essentially boils down to choosing the right course of action which ushers you towards spiritual evolution. It may sound like a mouthful. Karma yoga is the right course of action that ushers you towards spiritual evolution. So then the next question is, well, what is the right action? What is the best way to function in order to get myself moving in that direction? Now, from previous lectures, you'll understand that what inhibits right action is nothing but, anybody? What prevents you from choosing correctly or choosing the right thing to do? What is it that hinders this choice of right action, choosing the right thing? Adele, yes. Yes. In a broader, Adele has said desires. So in a broader context, we can say it is nothing but the mind. The mind prevents us, the mind's likes and dislikes. Remember, there's more aspects to the mind than just desires. Desires is the correct answer. But there are more aspects to the mind than just desires. We have the likes and dislikes. Now, if you continuously act on your likes, you'll understand from the second lesson, you're going to be stressed. But not only that, you're not necessarily going to be moving in the direction of spiritual evolution. Similarly with your attractions and aversions, your attachments, all of these spring from the mind. And this, in essence, is an enemy working against you. So when we look at the world today, most people are completely unaware of this simple fact. That's why we always say the ABC of Vedanta is BMI. Body, mind, intellect. Once you understand the fundamentals of the human composition, it's so much easier to get on with the world. Remember, Vedanta ushers you towards a state of more maturity, inner peace, as it were, for which you need to understand your inner personality. Inner personality is nothing but mind and intellect. So what karma yoga does, it obviously, and this is why when we say karma yoga is for the active person, someone balanced in mind and intellect. So there is a component of intellect as well as mind in the practice of this discipline. So what essentially happens in karma yoga is the intellect is able to envisage an ideal. And when we talk about an ideal, it's important that we understand an ideal is slightly different to a goal. An ideal is something that you work towards that is beneficial not only to yourself, it benefits a larger community. That larger community could be a partner, it could be your family, it could be your neighborhood, it could be your company. All of these things are a larger community, something outside of yourself. If you're purely working for yourself and your self-centered interests, that is a goal. I have a goal to get very rich. Why? Well, it's going to give me a lot of comforts. It's going to give me a lot of nice things. It's going to give me security, whatever it is. For who? For you. Goal. Nothing wrong with that. We're not saying there's anything wrong with that. But what we are talking about is an ideal. So the intellect is able to conceive of an ideal, something beyond your self-centered interest, and then it slowly shifts the mind, the interest and attention towards that ideal in life, towards that higher value, something more encompassing, something more meaningful, something more purposeful. Anything that exists, any form of activity that is above your self-centered interests is moving in the direction of evolution. See, as a human being, you have this capacity to either evolve or devolve. Now, evolution and devolution is degrees essentially of selfish vis-a-vis unselfish behavior. A person who devolves is egocentric and selfish. They're only interested in their own demands being met. What can the world offer me personally? Lowest cadre of people. Now, for a person who's interested in self-development, you need to start attuning your actions towards catering to a larger circle, a greater circle of identification, in other words. So all a karma yogi does is he dedicates his life's activities towards that set ideal. Now, you shouldn't get confused. This doesn't mean a change in vocation. Nowhere does Vedanta say, whatever you're doing now, if it's not in terms of servicing your fellow man, drop it. It's not practical. For instance, you could be a lawyer practicing in a law firm. You could be a cook cooking in a restaurant. You could be a tennis player playing a match. Now, if I had to ask you at face value, are those spiritual disciplines? Are any of those spiritual disciplines? Is a lawyer, a cook, or a tennis player a spiritual discipline? Any ideas? Are any of those vocations spiritual? Yes, no, maybe. No, great. No, Rian says, no, they're not spiritual. Anybody else? Anyone else want to have a stab? Thanks, Rian. Who else is?
Yes, it can be.
Harish, it can be. Caitlin.
It can be. Depends. Yeah, it depends on the attitude.
There we go. There we go. Okay. So it seems as though we've got a few Vedantins in the classroom. Is always good. Depends on how you practice them. There we go. So none of those actions per se are either spiritual or non-spiritual. Why are you doing them? What makes something spiritual or not spiritual is your attitude towards the activity. So you could be in a law office. What's your attitude? A selfish attitude could be, lawyers make a lot of money. I can't wait for my paycheck at the end of the month. It's coming in. I got some big clients, some big money to be made here. Selfish. Or it could be, how can I best serve the interests of my clients? Ensure that they get the fairest trial or the fairest legal opportunities. That could be the attitude. Cook could be cooking for his paycheck or he could have a genuine interest of serving his clientele, his patrons. Similarly with a tennis player, playing to uplift the game. That's all. Win or lose, it's immaterial. Just playing to uplift the game. It's all for tennis. So you can appreciate it. Karma Yoga doesn't envisage you now dropping your job and going and working in a soup kitchen. That's not it. All it takes is a shift in mental attitude. What is that shift in mental attitude? Something towards service and sacrifice. How can I best serve? Sacrifice. What are you sacrificing? The only thing you're sacrificing in Karma Yoga is your own ego and egocentric desires and demands. What happens when those are sacrificed at the altar of Karma Yoga? Desires decrease, evolution increases. You are developing. You have engaged in a successful self-development practice. Karma Yoga can essentially be summed up in this beautiful phrase, après vous. Après vous means after you. Learn that art of giving. The beautiful Khalil Gibran. This is part of a longer poem, but the way he defines giving is, you got to read this. If any of you have not had access to it, I suggest you search this on the Google there and look for this Khalil Gibran on giving. Don't worry, you may read the poem and go, oh my God, now I've got to give up giving. It's very, very complex and complicated. If you do this, it's not giving. If you do that, it's semi-giving. Very complicated. But this phrase really highlights it. He says, he's describing true giving. They give as in yonder valley, the myrtle breathes its fragrance into space. It's one of the most beautiful phrases or quotes or ways to define giving. Give as yonder valley, the myrtle. A myrtle is a plant, right? Yonder valley. Where's yonder valley? Far away from anybody. Nobody can see it. Breathes its fragrance. It just comes naturally into space. It's giving of that beautiful fragrance and nobody can see it. Absolutely, just because that's its nature. Beautiful definition of giving. So that's with reference to the body. Someone who's active, balanced in mind and intellect, engages the body in Karma Yoga. Of course, we appreciate the mental component to it, as well as the intellectual facet to it. Bhakti Yoga. Now, Bhakti Yoga is often associated with faith. He has faith in God. He is a true bhakti, devotional type person. Now, when we say faith, we're not talking about a blind faith here. No, I have faith. Faith in what? Faith in God. Why? No, that's it, faith. So when we talk about faith, it's not just a blind faith. Why do you say that? No, that's what I believe. Faith must be supported by corroboratory evidences. See, if you have faith without support, that segues into or leads to what we call as fanatic attachment. Why all the wars fought these days in terms of religion? Even within religions, there's sects of Islamic, various sects within the Islamic faith. There are various sects within the Christian faith, Protestants, Catholics, everyone fighting against each other because of is nothing but attachment, fanaticism. So this is not what we're talking about. So when we talk about bhakti, when we talk about this devotion, now obviously this is geared towards the individual who is predominantly devotional. He only knows this emotion, this pouring out of emotion. So when we talk about bhakti, obviously the intellect lacks the capacity to comprehend the reality or take up the study of knowledge as a primary driver in his spiritual pursuit. So what is left for the person engaging his mind? Well, that path is the path of devotion. So in the path of devotion, what happens is, you see, what you have to appreciate is that devotion arises essentially from areas of your ignorance. Now, I'll give you a simple example. You do not know so many things. You do not know medicine. You do not know law. You do not know engineering. So you get it, you get sick. You don't know what's wrong with you. I don't know. So what happens? You take yourself off to the doctor. Doctor, I'm sick. What's wrong? And then you tell him, it's a bit this, it's ache, all this. Okay. He uses his knowledge to formulate a diagnosis. So you are ignorant of medicine. You're ignorant of how the body works. So you surrender to a doctor. And that doctor writes your prescription or gives you the exercise or whatever it is. Similarly with law, you don't know the laws, so you go to a lawyer. You want to build a house, you don't know how much support this one needs, how much foundation, what can this overlying beam, none of that you know. You go to an engineer or architect, and they design it and build it. So when it comes to life, there are so many things we don't know about life. Where did we come from? Where are we going? When will the journey end? What happens once the journey's finished? Did the chicken come first? Did the egg come first? Who's your father's first father? I don't know. So devotion is a surrender to that vast area of ignorance. I don't know. So devotion, in a way, is the observance of nature. And this is one of the ways in which someone can start engaging in this practice. So you start recognizing that life functions meticulously, even within your own body. It's amazing. You cut yourself, and what happens? All the forces in your body go there. And what happens? Bleeds, and the bleeding stops and seals the wound. And the next day, you may see a little bit of dried blood. You scrape that away, and within a week or two, what's happened? That cut, that wound is completely gone. Amazing how the forces come together. As we breathe out oxygen, the trees breathe in as we breathe out CO2, the trees breathe it in and give us oxygen. This mutual exchange, beautiful exchange going on. Amazing. So we appreciate that life around us, nature, functions meticulously, beautifully. Who's controlling all of that? How is it all happening? We get into this beautiful age of contemplation. What's going on? The bhakti doesn't know. He can't intellectually conceive it. So he surrenders. She surrenders. There in bhakti yoga, this yoga of devotion, it's developing this acute awareness for the infinite blessings showered on everyone, followed by a sense of gratitude. Now, one of the ways in which one can start this discipline is with a gratitude practice. Just sitting quietly, preferably in the morning, and clearing your mind as much as possible, and just letting that sense of gratitude. What am I grateful for? Just allow that thought to infiltrate your mind. Something comes in there. It may be something different every day. Maybe the same thing. Allow it to just fill the mind. I'm Grateful I've got this roof over my head. I'm grateful I just had a full plate of food. Now, what that does is this feeling of gratitude for something that I have, it gives you a feeling of completeness, of fulfillment in a way. So that feeling of fulfillment you get from an acknowledgement of blessings. They're all blessings given unto you. That feeling generates this devotion to this higher hand, this higher power, whatever it is, whatever you can conceive of, guarding everything, guarding and controlling. How is it that every law in the universe is so meticulously maintained? How is that happening? Sun rises every morning, sets every evening. The whole universe perfectly. And it's almost a orchestrated dance. It's moving around. If you can't see it in the macrocosmic level, look at it in the microcosmic level. Look at your own body, how the forces come together. Even seeing a sight. Do you know how many millions of operations that takes in the eye, in the body, in the cells? Millions and millions. There's a beautiful word in Sanskrit. It's called ascharya. Ascharya means wonderment. There's this wonderment. When you have that sense of wonderment, this ability to see the splash of divinity all around you, this is bhakti. This is the yoga of devotion. Now, what this devotion does essentially is it annihilates the sense of self-importance. I'm just a spoke in the wheel of this beautiful orchestration of life. Jnana Yoga. Now, Jnana Yoga is for those who are inquiring into the mystery of life and the world. Who am I? What is my purpose here? What am I doing here? What is this sojourn all about? How did we get here? Who created all of this? A person who is actively engaged in the inquiry into the mysteries of life, that person is inclined towards the practice or the discipline of jnana or knowledge. Now, we're not talking about knowing a lot of things, erudition and scholarship. So it's not about how much you know. That's not necessarily, that's just having a vast collection of knowledge, of intelligence. When we talk about jnana, when we talk about this self-development practice, what it means is having the capacity and ability to start contemplating and reflecting on the truth of life. Vedanta is essentially centered on jnanam, Vedanta jnanam, which is knowledge. You'll find that through this entire course, the emphasis has been on knowledge, imparting and absorbing. See, is one thing for the teacher to sit here and impart knowledge. No amount of knowledge will make any dent within the personality. All the knowledge. I could give lectures every night. Won't make a difference. So what is required is an internal discipline to reflect and contemplate on those truths being presented. That is the practice. Nitya Anitya Viveka Vichara. This sums up Jnana Yoga. Now, this perhaps leans more onto the absolute sense in that Jnana Yoga essentially is that question which asks, what is permanent, what is impermanent? What is eternal, what is ephemeral or passing? You start investigating the difference between the reality and that which is unreal. So essentially, who am I? Now, we could get into this, in fact, a very, very interesting discussion. Who am I? Well, when you're young, you declare, I'm a young boy. As you get older, I'm a teenager. I'm a young man. I'm a man. I'm an old man. And you'll appreciate that every progression through life is different. The boy is not the teenager is not the young man is not the man, and the man is not the old man. All different. But there is a commonality. There is a common factor that threads through all of those various changing facets. I. What is that I? So the pursuit of that I, that unchanging, immutable, fixed, constant factor, the pursuit and determined attempt to understand the real personality. And when we say real personality, we call that as the self or God, or if you want, that absolute state of peace and bliss. Remember, we referred to in the beginning. Any pursuit of that is jnana yoga, dedicated towards the intellectual type person. Jnana yoga is highly effective in the removal of your ignorance of your true nature. Any attempt at removing ignorance is removing desires. So when we talk about the application of these disciplines or these practices, what essentially we understand that it's pertaining to eradication of desire, but how exactly does this work? So at the active level, karma yoga, what karma yoga does is it reduces the bulk of your desires, because you're shifting your attention from myself onto how can I be of usefulness to others. You're therefore reducing the bulk of your ego and egocentric desires. In terms of bhakti yoga, you can appreciate it's the quality of the desires that changes from the secular to the sublime, or should I say, from a lower quality to a higher quality. Jnana yoga changes the direction, from the secular to the sublime, from the lower to the higher. So when we talk about these integrated spiritual disciplines, because again, none of us are purely, Miriam, I'll get to your question just after this. None of us are purely intellectual, purely emotional, or purely active. We have this makeup, as it were. So and this is why we call these integrated spiritual disciplines. So again, it comes down to one's assessment of their particular nature. Having assessed, then you define these practices accordingly. So say you are, to give you an example, say you are 60% active, 30% emotional, 10% intellectual. Therefore, your spiritual practices will need to match that. So 60% active means 60% of your energy, time, and effort must be engaged in karma yoga. 30% must be engaged in bhakti yoga, recognizing divinity, surrendering to that unseen hand, and 10% to contemplation, knowledge, study, assuming this is your makeup. So, and this is a massive mistake that people often make. They don't assess. They don't take the time to stop and just assess their nature. What are they like? What constitutes their personality? Where is the emphasis within their inner personality placed? And therefore, you find people that come to Vedanta and they go, this is no sense. Of course, there's no sense. If you're more inclined to devotional practices, it won't make any sense. Or if you're more inclined towards action, activity, rajasic, you all the time got to be doing things. This will be very difficult to absorb. So it's in your interest to figure out where you are and then take up those disciplines accordingly. So when you practice these three disciplines, and you will need to practice them all. Why? Because you will have a body, You have a mind and you have an intellect. So the first thing that happens is when you practice these disciplines, you reach a state of withdrawal, uparati. This is a sense of dispassion or detachment, as we call it. You're detached from the world. In other words, your happiness is not dependent on external environments, circumstances, or even people. You have attained a state of, or a state that is closer to inner peace. As you move along this path of self-development or spiritual evolution, you then reach a point of dharana, which is concentration, general concentration. You become sharp, alert. There is a clarity of mind. Why? Desires have dropped off. That mental agitation ceased. It's like a body of water, a lake. Can imagine when the wind is blowing, it's really ruffled. The ripples on the surface can even create small waves in a lake. Now, as that settles, slowly you can almost see the reflection. This is like being able to concentrate, having the clarity of mind. As you progress along, you get to the point of dhyana. Dhyana, meditation, sorry, dhyana, meditation. So you can appreciate here meditation, and the talk would not be complete unless I'd mentioned this in terms of a practice. Meditation, where is its position in terms of attaining a permanent state of peace and bliss? Well, it's right next to it. In other words, meditation is the last lap of the spiritual journey. You don't meditate to get a calm mind. When your mind is calm, equanimous, you are then set to be fit for meditation. See, most people now believe you meditate to get a calm mind. If you can appreciate this diagram, if you can appreciate this path, you'll appreciate that you're putting the cart before the horse. You see, how can you meditate when there's so many desires, so many unfulfilled desires agitating the mind? It's impossible. You need a calm mind to meditate. The more desires, more agitation, less your chance of being able to meditate. Less desires, less agitation, calmer mind, single pointed focus. Remember, this is actually how we define meditation. Now, I'm defining meditation because this is what I mean by meditation. So many different versions and definitions of meditation are given. This is why we have to define what we mean. So meditation is the art of the intellect holding the mind on a single thought, that's one thought, to the exclusion of all other thoughts. Now, of course, if you take this strict definition, and this is exactly what Vedanta is saying, how can you concentrate on one thought if you are laden with desires? The analogy given is, imagine an aeroplane. Now, you know, you're only allowed 30 kgs of luggage or 20 kgs, depending on the size of the plane, international or local flight. Why? They got to make sure that the plane is not too heavy. They've calculated how maximum amount of weight that plane can take off with. Now imagine everyone can bring as much as they like and the cargo down, the hold is full, and what's going to happen to that plane? Never going to be able to take off. It won't ever take off. Too heavy for the power that it needs to get up in the air. This is exactly like trying to meditate with an agitated mind, with a mind that is full of desires. It's impossible. So meditation is, yes, it's the very effective discipline, the very effective spiritual practice, but it comes right at the end. You need to qualify to meditate. Sitting in meditation, chanting the mantra Om, focusing on one thought, and essentially that is Om. Om represents the ultimate ideal, the self, Atman, or God. through the process of meditation, you drop that final desire and you merge with that reality, with that self. You gain the state of self-realization or absolute peace, happiness, and bliss. All right.